And last night on this very program, the country heard for the very first time George Zimmerman, the man that is charged with second-degree murder for the shooting death of Trayvon Martin. Now, there are a few parts from my sit-down interview with Zimmerman that are causing quite a stir, especially one clip in particular. Watch this. Is there anything you regret? Do you regret getting out of the car to follow Trayvon that night?
No, sir.
Do you regret that you had a gun that night?
No, sir.
Do you feel you wouldn't be here for this interview if you didn't have that gun?
No, sir.
You feel you would not be here?
I feel that it was all God's plan, and for me to second guess it or judge it.
Is there anything you might do differently in retrospect now that time has passed a little bit?
No, sir.
And earlier today on Fox and Friends, Trayvon Martin's parents responded to what George Zimmerman told me. Listen to this.
I don't understand what he was thinking by saying that it was God's plan that he murdered our child. And I really don't understand what God he worships, because it's not the same God that I worship.
Sabrina?
And why would God have him to kill an unarmed teenager? I mean, it just makes no sense. So,
what plan is it by, I mean, that's heartless to say that that was God's plan that he took our child's life.
And joining me now with reaction is one of the Martin family attorneys, Darryl Parks. Mr. Parks, welcome back to the program. Thank you for being with us.
Good afternoon.
Now, I noticed that the media did run with that particular phrase, God's plan. If you listen to the entire quote, what he said before that, I was asking him if he thought he would be here, meaning on Earth, and he said, no, sir. He said he didn't think he would be here. And he gives an explanation. In context, does it sound different to you? He also talked about praying for the Martin family every day.
Well, I think that you can't take the two statements together. I think for him to inject God's plan into the situation certainly was not in God's plan for an unarmed teenager to be killed in this situation. So that's what made it so difficult for them, that he kind of tries to downplay it as being God's plan when it was his actions that took Trayvon's life.
But before he said God's plan, he said, I asked him, do you think you would be here? No, sir. Meaning he thought, what he was saying is he thought he'd be dead.
Well, anyway, regardless of that, it goes back to the fact that had he stayed in the car, none of this ever happens. He takes it upon himself. One of the problems that Trayvon's parents have always had about this situation, George never takes responsibility for his action. When you ask him about, does he regret having a gun, does he regret getting out of the car, he doesn't regret any of that. Those are things that he did. So those are the things that brought about what happened later that night.
Let me go back and George Zimmerman giving his version last night in this interview with a lot of detail of what he says happened and how Trayvon confronted him and struck him and immediately broke his nose. I want you to, let me remind you about this part of the interview from last night. And you said to him, I don't have a problem.
Yes, sir.
You reached for your phone.
I reached for it as I was saying, no, I don't have a problem.
And at that point, you just got hit?
He was already within arm's length from me.
And was that the punch in the nose that broke your nose?
Yes, sir.
Right there, and you went immediately down to the ground?
I don't remember if I went immediately to the ground or if he pushed me to the ground, but I ended up on the ground.
And at one point you said that you wanted to stop him from hitting your head on the cement.
Yes, sir.
Is that what you told the police?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so after that first hit, what happened next?
He started bashing my head into the concrete sidewalk. As soon as he broke my nose, I started yelling for help. So I was disoriented, and he started slamming my head into the concrete.
Which is where the lacerations came from.
Yes, sir.
You said it was like your head was going to explode. It was a comment that you had given to the police.
Yes, sir. He continued to punch me in the head.
How many times would you estimate that he punched you?
Several. More than a dozen.
Mr. Parks, I wasn't there, you weren't there. What do you make of his version of the events that night?
Well, I understand his explanation, but I think that we have to always go back to the fact that had he stayed in the car, right, and we have to also remember that Mr. Zimmerman is in a vehicle and he's traveling. Trayvon is a pedestrian, he's walking, right? There are two different speeds going on here. And so if he never gets out of the vehicle, they never have this encounter. So for him to make Trayvon out to be the perpetrator, we don't buy it.
Well, let me ask you this. In terms of getting a guilty verdict in this case, and that listening to his version, looking at the injuries he incurred, he did have a broken nose. He did have lacerations in the back of his head. And this is just evidence that we know. There might be other evidence that comes up that has not been made public at this point. There was the one eyewitness from that night that said that he did see Trayvon on top of Mr. Zimmerman. And that he was punching him. How do you, with all that we do know up to this point, there may be more evidence, more information coming out, but with all of that put together, how do you get a second-degree murder conviction? Bring me to how you get there. Tell me what you would argue.
First of all, you certainly have to argue that when he saw Trayvon, he called him a punk for whatever reason. And number two, and that's without knowing anything about him, without him seeing him doing anything wrong. And so all of those things play a part of him profiling him. And so he follows Trayvon.
Yeah, but he didn't say that to Trayvon. He said he was talking to the dispatcher.
He was talking to the dispatcher, but it all goes to his mindset. The one thing about George Zimmerman, he never likes to talk about all the events that happened prior to the altercation. All of those things are very important because it goes to his intent, his mindset, and most importantly, though, it is very basic evidence that George Zimmerman is not allowed to frame himself.
Well, let me ask you this.
It's recorded real time.
Because it's not illegal to get out of the car, or if you think somebody's suspicious, whether he was right or wrong in this case. But again, I go back to the one eyewitness that said he saw Trayvon on top of Mr. Zimmerman, the injuries that we know that took place, including the broken nose. He's now consistently, to the police and others, given that same story about what happened that night and the next day where he reenacted it. Bring me from that point, evidence before a jury, and then he tells the story about the gun. How do you get a guilty verdict if, in fact, he's claiming that Trayvon attacked him, confronted him, and struck him first? How do you get there?
Well, I think most reasonable people will see when they hear this case is that Trayvon was doing nothing wrong, and he was confronted by George. George Zimmerman got out of his truck and confronted him. Trayvon, one, did nothing whatsoever. He was provoked. And so when Trayvon is followed, he doesn't know this guy at all. And this guy is looking at him in a suspicious way. So anyone, especially once he realizes that this guy is armed, for him to fight for his life, and you hear him talking about his nose was broken.
How was he provoked?
Trayvon was fighting a man with a 9mm. Yeah, well, he was fighting a man with a 9mm.
But the eyewitness said that Trayvon was on top of him.
Well, he should have been on top of him. If this guy was stalking him and this guy is armed, he should have been beating him. That's common.
Even if he was walking back, even if he was walking back to his car, and I don't know what happened. I wasn't there, but the eyewitness said if in fact George Zimmerman, what he's saying is true, and Trayvon confronted him and came up to him, you don't think that's problematic in terms of getting a conviction?
I don't think that's problematic for this reason. And, we can sit here and try and listen to George Zimmerman's nice statement about it, but the great thing that we have in this case is a 911 audio where he tells the dispatcher he's following the person. Now, he tries to explain it away later, but it'll be up to a trial fact to decide whether they believe that or not.
Mr. Parks, thank you once again for coming back on the program. We appreciate it.